Hi, everybody. It's Kate Angel with the Natural Areas Association and
Lisa Smith with the Natural Areas Association.
And Angela Sturdevant.
Hi.
We're going to get started this morning, or this afternoon, actually, for a lot of people. We're coming to you from our office in Ligonier, Pennsylvania, so just so you know where we are. A few housekeeping details. We are not going to be using chat for questions. We're going to be using Q&A, and there's a good reason for that, which I can tell you later. But if you have questions for Angela, even during her presentation, just type them into the Q&A, and we'll make sure they get answered. The way we're going to do this is we're pretty much going to wait until the middle of the Angela's presentation to answer questions, and we'll also have another period at the end where we can answer questions. Just so you know, we're also not going to raise hands on this. We're going to stick to one form of technology for the questions and answers. And that's, I think, it's time for us to show our slides here. Okay. Again, welcome everybody, and Lisa is going to take it away.
Okay. So welcome folks again. We're excited. This is, you are the lucky people who get to be a part of our kickoff webinar for the Natural Areas Association webinar series. And today we welcome Angela Sturdevant, who is going to present the new Long-term Stewardship Calculator to you. Angela's with the Nature Conservancy, Indiana's field office. And we'll say a few more things about Angela in a moment. But I would like to just, again, welcome you, but also mention too that the webinar, I'm going to tell you in a minute a little bit about NAA for those of you who aren't familiar with us. But webinars are part of our continuing commitment to bring you the latest and most relevant information as natural areas practitioners. The Natural Areas Association has been an organization that's been in place for almost 43 years now, and for those of you who do know us, you know what we do. For those of you who don't, we are a professional organization that exists to support folks like you, folks like you who are working to conserve and manage natural areas in perpetuity. We do that in a number of ways. We have an annual conference. This will be our 43rd conference this fall in Davis, California. Please visit our website to learn a little bit more about that conference. But it's an exciting gathering of practitioners from across the country. The conference is one way that we are able to advance conservation, natural areas conservation information. But it's also an important way for us to convene our community of practitioners. There are a lot of organizations that don't do conferences anymore for obvious reasons, but we are committed to convening our community for every year, and we do that so that we can convey the latest information and research, management techniques, conservation practices to folks, but also we feel strongly that we learn best from one another when we can be face-to-face, sharing, networking, and celebrating the work that we do. So a few of the other ways that we are advancing natural areas conservation is through the publication of our quarterly Natural Areas Journal. We are very much on a path of publishing special issues of that Natural Areas Journal dedicated to hot topics that we're all hearing about and having to consider in the management and conservation of natural areas. So our upcoming special issue that will be due out this fall is dedicated to managing for pollinators on natural areas. In addition to the journal, we have a newsletter. Some of you may have seen that recently, our most recent issue. We are very proactive in organizing workshops and symposia, both at our conference, and we will soon be organizing some of those on the ground across the country with the help of partners. you'll see here, I won't read all of the bullets, but we work hard to be advocates for those of you on the ground doing work. And we do that through getting active in policy issues, getting active in advocating for funding for the work that you do, and for helping advance your learning through all of these mechanisms. Be on the lookout for a brand new website that will be coming out soon too, that will help us in doing that good work. So if you're not a member of NAA, we implore you to give it some consideration and become a part of this great community of practitioners. Okay, and with that, I would like to just wrap by thanking our partner, the Bureau of Land Management, for their support of this webinar series. Okay.
Yes. All right. I wanted to put in a little plug here for our upcoming webinar. This is a series, so the next one to come down the pike is going to be August 23rd. And we're really excited to welcome Benjamin Zuckerberg from the University of Wisconsin. He's looking into sort of how you can see climate change work on the grounds in your natural areas nearby you, and what those impacts are. So we're really looking forward to welcoming him on August 23rd. And we're going to be putting out information about the registration very soon, so watch your email on that. And just a couple of things about Angela. We're so excited to have her here as well. She's the CODA Global Fellow with the Nature Conservancy's Mitigation Learning Network. Most of you may know that she's from the Indiana chapter of the Nature Conservancy. She's worked a lot of different places, and her background is in applied ecology, well, not, a lot of different places. Applied ecology, wetland restoration. And without more ado, we welcome Angela. Take it away.
All right. Just share my screen here. Okay, can you see that? Yes. Great. Well, I am going to talk about the long-term stewardship calculator that I created. My regular job is working for the Indiana chapter to help manage our preserves here throughout the state. But the TNC has a fellowship program to allow people to work on special projects alongside their regular jobs. So that's how I was able to work on this project to develop the calculator. Hopefully I'm preaching to the choir here when I talk about why long-term management of natural areas is important. But we can invest all this time and money in protecting and restoring natural areas, but if we don't have funding for long-term management, all that investment can be put at risk. So this came from the mitigation background in the Army Corps and their 2008 mitigation rule. They laid out specifically that all mitigation projects, mitigation banks, in lieu fee projects, and permittee responsible projects should have a long-term management plan along with those to ensure that after the Corps is signed off on the permit, that property continues to be maintained. So it's spelled out in the rule. And their justification for doing this was, if they're not maintained, it either results in a net loss of the aquatic resources that were mitigated for, or the long-term management manager gets stuck holding the bag, may have to raise additional funds for management and essentially end up subsidizing that mitigation. So either way, they were wanting to ensure that didn't happen. So that's the mitigation side, but it's also obviously important for land trusts and other land managers to ensure sustainable conservation of lands that are protected through voluntary actions not related to mitigation. The Land Trust Accreditation Commission has sufficient funding for long-term management as an indicator practice for accreditation, and long-term management funding is also included in the Land Trust Alliance standard and practices. So a lot of organizations realize that this is really important. Having said that, you have to balance having adequate funding for long-term management with making that too expensive and overly burdensome to try and invest funds in typically an endowment to generate annual revenue to cover those expenses. So we understand funding long-term management is important, but it's easier said than done to really figure out what number to put on that. So the Nature Conservancy received a grant from the US EPA, from the National Wetland Program Development Grant Program, to develop a long-term stewardship cost calculator to help, just to provide a tool for people to better estimate those costs associated with long-term management and ensure that funding is available. So this was an 18-month-long process. We put together an advisory committee of experts, both within TNC and with several partner organizations, not just from the mitigation side, but other voluntary conservation practitioners as well. We spent months doing research and over two dozen interviews of practitioners with various expertise, just trying to tap into all of the knowledge that's out there to get a handle on current practices, gathering example calculators for how people are currently doing this. And there's a lot of, everyone's doing it differently. There's a lot of good examples and some bad examples. And we tried to get a handle on the typical long-term management activities, and then also those that are more commonly overlooked or underestimated. And there is a tool out there, as I said, there's lots of spreadsheets that people use. There's a tool called the Property Analysis Record, or PAR, and that uses a very complex database methodology to analyze what long-term management activities are needed for a particular property, and then to estimate the costs associated with that. But it's not free. You have to pay to use it. It's really more specific to the Western US, especially California, and they have kind of a unique regulatory environment there. And it's a standalone program that you have to download on your computer. So it's a black box and you can't see really the calculations that are going on behind the scene. So we talked with the woman who created PAR as we were developing this free tool, and tried to really understand that as we developed this. So the calculator we developed, the purpose was to consolidate and highlight the common expenses to improve the ease and accuracy of calculating those costs, and then to estimate the average annual stewardship costs, to calculate the initial principal amount for a stewardship fund. Or if you're, say, a state agency and you don't have a stewardship fund or a dedicated fund for stewardship, it would also be a helpful tool just for your annual budgeting process, or just to try and document how much it costs to manage a particular property. And our ultimate goal is to ensure that these properties have a secure source of funding into the future. So it's not too surprising, but our research revealed what we already knew, that costs vary greatly based on location, regional differences in pricing across the country, types of habitat, a number of different factors. So we decided to create a simple Excel workbook calculator that can be used anywhere for any project. It's adaptable for projects with a wide range of sizes, habitats, and locations. And then along with that, we created a handbook that discusses the typical tasks and factors to consider when you're estimating those costs, and then suggestions on how to develop the cost estimates. And there was a concern that if we put actual unit costs into the calculator, such as like $3.75 a square foot for a 3-strand barbed wire fence, that 5 years from now, people would still be using that same unit cost, even if the cost of steel went up and it's now $7 a foot. So we decided it was more important to consider the appropriate activities needed on a site, rather than trying to put unit cost estimates on every possible activity or structure that might be out there. So like, it's more important to consider whether you need a barbed wire fence gate that costs maybe $50 to build, but has very little structural integrity, so it needs to be replaced a lot more often, versus a sturdier Powder River gate that's a lot more expensive to install, like $1,200, but may last 20 years. So it's those sorts of things that the handbook has a lot of discussion to help prompt you to think through those. So as I said, we recognize that the cost of stewardship varies greatly across regions and across different project types. There's no simple one-size-fits-all cost calculation, but we tried to create a standard approach for people to use that ensures you're capturing all the realistic costs and not undermining the project's long-term sustainability. And it is free, it's available to the public, it's not just a TNC product. It's on a website that anyone can download. There's the calculator and then the handbook to go along with it. And it's intended to be used for not just mitigation projects, but any kind of conservation project, not just fee lands, but also easements. So easement holders could fill it out, landowners and long-term managers, mitigation providers, regulatory agencies if they want to do a check on whether adequate funds are being set aside. And I'm going to try out the laser pointer on this. So this is really the foundation of the calculator, this formula. The calculator allows you to estimate the annual costs associated with managing a preserve, and then you divide that by the capitalization rate, and that tells you how much needs to go into a fund as the initial principal to fund those annual tasks. And I'll talk a bit more about the cap rate later on, but this is really important to get this right. It's the nominal return on investment minus inflation minus any fees. So I'll show an example of that later. I mentioned the handbook, which we printed some copies, but mostly it's available for download as a PDF off of our website, and it just includes information to help users better understand the different sections and the line items in the calculator, and then point you to additional resources if you have further questions. So this lists just a brief overview of what's in the handbook. And there is a step-by-step guide. So if you know all about stewardship activities, you don't need to reference the background reading material. You can jump to the guide, the step-by-step quick reference guide, to help you just fill out the calculator itself. So I am going to show you an example of the calculator in use based on a purely fictitious project. This is a 200-acre preserve owned by a land trust with high-quality oak hickory forest that's home to the endangered Indiana bat. So I threw that in. I'm from Indiana. The property's been actively managed and preserved for over 10 years following the goals and objectives laid out in the long-term management plan. And long-term management activities on the property include controlling invasive species, some vegetation management, fire, and then monitoring the bat population. So in our example, a few years down the line, the land trust managing the property begins to realize the endowment is running low. They won't have enough funds to continue to manage the property at the same level into the future. So we'll use the calculator to figure out how much it actually costs to manage this property. And this is purely fictitious. Some of the numbers are not entirely accurate. So just to show you how it works. So as I said, it's an Excel spreadsheet, and this is the result of the months of research and looking at good and bad examples and trying to distill all that down into this calculator. So there's 4 tabs. It starts with the Assumptions tab, where you enter some unit costs. Then there's 2 tabs related to activities on the property, and it's all pulled together on the summary. And I'll note there's some basic instructions down here at the bottom. I just didn't include them in this screenshot. So you enter values in the blue shaded cells. the basic project information, and then these blue cells here. Okay, so for each tab, I'm going to show an overview of the whole tab and then try and zoom in so you can really see the content a bit better. So here you enter your average hourly rates for regular staff and short-term staff, or if you choose to drill down and get real specific, you can click on this plus button here, and that expands to allow you to enter in up to 6 different hourly rates. So if you had a specific hourly rate for like a staff ecologist and a field technician, you can enter those there and type in the name of the type of staff and then the rate. But for the purposes of this example, we're sticking with 2 rates to keep it simple. And then you enter the travel costs. So for our example, the property is fairly close and we're not expecting to have to stay overnight for any of our site visits. If we had a average round trip cost for travel, we could enter that here rather than figuring mileage. And then in the additional rates section, this is where the cap rate that I had mentioned gets put in. And that, again, is the % of the fund that's expected to be spent each year on the long-term stewardship activities. So for our example, we used 4.5%. And if you add to that 3% inflation and 1% admin fees, we need to achieve a target rate of return of 8.5% for our endowment. So it's really important to choose an appropriate cap rate and then think about how you need to manage your endowment to get that return. So there's a whole section in the handbook on that. Then you can choose this defaults to funding 100% of the annual costs, but some land trusts have policies in place where they only need to set aside enough to cover 50% of the costs and the rest will be covered out of operating expenses. So you can change this if you need to. I'm leaving it at 100%. And then we've included rates for contingency, which covers just in case my cost estimates weren't completely accurate or there's unforeseen price fluctuations in the future or just other costs that come up that we didn't think of. We've found that rates between 10 and 20% are common. And then the administrative rate covers the cost of doing business, paying for the computers and the office rent and all of that kind of stuff. So going to the second tab, these are all activities related to site protection monitoring and easement stewardship. And this is just an overall view of the whole page. I'll zoom in on the following slides. And the idea here is each property should have a long-term management plan in place. And best practice would be to develop that first and then use the calculator to estimate costs associated with each of those tasks in the long-term management plan. And this is further divided into activities associated with monitoring the site protection mechanism, which could be either a conservation easement, a deed restriction, or fee ownership, and then maintaining landowner or neighbor relationships, and finally enforcement to correct violations. And I'll go into each of these in more detail. So if you had used additional staff rates on the previous tab, you could click on this plus up here, and that would expand so that you can enter hours for each one of those staff types down here in the blue boxes. But again, for this example, I've left that out. So we included time for a site visit annually. And then one thing that was often overlooked or underestimated was you need to budget for more than just the time spent on site. You really have to set aside some time to get ready for the site visit and then to document it afterwards. So we've included hours for all of that, and then a bit of hours for communications and outreach, just additional talking with neighbors or whatever might come up. Then we have 2 ways to record travel expenses, and this is where the mileage and the per diem and any overnight expenses are pulled in from the assumptions tab. So for this, we've planned on 1 trip with 2 days of meals, which is the 2 people down here. And that's multiplied out to give you the cost of the trip. We also budgeted for some supplies, and like an iPad, maybe a UAV. We just got one for the Indiana chapter, so that's been useful for monitoring sites, cameras, any other supplies. So this is kind of an arbitrary made-up number. For the purposes of this example, it's probably high, but we are using these on more than just this preserve, so it will be used 4% of the time on this property, which is 200 acres out of a larger 5,000 acre complex. So I used the 0.04 here. Now I need to figure out where my cursor went. Okay, and then this is the rest of the sheet further off to the right. So it calculates out the extended costs, multiplying that total for supplies by the 0.04. And we only expect to have to replace those supplies every 3 years. So this number divided by 3 gives you the annual cost. And there's a notes column where you can include details on how those costs were estimated, how the hours break down for each task, any other notes you need to include. You may notice the responsible party column. In some instances, there may be multiple parties involved with different tasks or different roles on a particular property, so you can indicate that here. So for example, on a mitigation project, if the mitigation provider is managing the land, but a land trust holds the easement, then those 2 parties could fill out the different portions of the spreadsheet separately. And the final thing on this tab is legal defense, which is very important. And legal defense just refers to any actions that are taken to uphold that land protection mechanism, the easement, deed restriction, or fee ownership, to resolve disputes with neighbors, fence line disputes, cattle trespass, timber theft, competing claims of ownership, any kind of violation of the terms of the easement. Simple enforcement actions can cost thousands of dollars, and litigation can cost tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. So if funding isn't set aside for this, it can really sink an organization. And we've provided, I saw a lot of different examples of different ways to cover this. So we provided 2 options in the calculator. Either the option A is setting aside a lump sum for legal defense. Option B is calculating the estimated costs associated with a legal challenge, which on average may happen every 8 years. So recognizing that this is really hard to do, we strongly recommend going the lump sum route. So in this example, our land trust has a policy to set aside $5,000 for legal defense of each new property. And if an organization doesn't have a policy in place, or if they want to review their policy to make sure it's adequate, the Land Trust Alliance just this past year developed a legal defense reserve calculator that's a really robust tool to help you figure out what that amount should be. It calculates the minimum reserve needed for a portfolio of easements and fee properties held by a land trust. And they based it on robust actuarial data on more than 22,000 challenges from more than 400 land trusts. So there's a lot of data behind there. And they use some complex models to consider how various risk factors affect the likelihood and severity of challenges. There's higher than average claim frequencies in some states, including California, New York, Florida, and New Jersey. Urban, suburban areas tend to encounter legal challenges more often. The length of time a land trust or an organization has been in operation just increases the likelihood of a challenge. And then the the rate and severity of those challenges. So for the purposes of our calculator, you can use the Land Trust Alliance calculator for an individual project to determine how much that proposed project would increase the minimum reserve needed by running the calculator with and without the proposed project included in that portfolio of sites, and then come up with that lump sum to put in here. They have a lot of information on their website, and I've included the email to contact for non-members to get access to the calculator because it's developed to be a tool for their members. So, having thrown a lot of screenshots at you, we're going to sit back, take a deep breath, see if you have any questions on that part of it before I go through the example on the second half of the calculator. All right, so I see one question in the Q&A, whether the presentation will be available for download. And I guess that's a question for Kate, but I'd be happy to provide it after.
I can answer that one really quickly, Angela. Yes, it will be. We're recording now, and the idea is that we'll upload it to the Natural Areas Association's YouTube channel. And some of you will get that link in follow-up emails. So stay tuned for that.
Great. And I recognize I'm kind of going through it quickly here, but it's not so much about the particular numbers that I've put into this example, it's just how it's set up overall. And then you can go to our website, download the calculator and the handbook, and really just look at it more closely. Okay, there is another question. From a state parks agency, how can the info be used for budgeting rather than calculating a long-term stewardship fund? It's really set up for a specific property. So if you budget for an overall kind of portfolio of sites, it may be more difficult, but if you're trying to get a handle on how much it costs to manage annually a particular property, then I would think it would work for that as well, and just look more at the annual costs. It sums up the total annual cost for each of these tabs at the bottom of the tab, and you could use that for your budgeting. And then there's another question where it can be downloaded from. I'm going to give the website at the end. Okay, so I'm going to move on, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions again at the end. So the third tab is the land management and maintenance, and this is really those activities that are more associated with the on the ground management of the land and any infrastructure that's on the property. So I've grouped it into maintenance and replacement of infrastructure, and then ecological management and occupancy. So for this example, there's not much infrastructure on the property, but there are some signs and a couple of vehicles. Go back to my laser pointer. So you can see here, I've estimated the number of signs that will be needed to be replaced every 3 years, gives you that annual cost. And then I just noted over here that the time to actually replace those signs would be included in the annual site visit on the previous tab. This gets a little redundant having the site visit here, but we just wanted to make sure that adequate time is budgeted for staff time on site to actually accomplish these activities. And then the other thing we included here was, again, a truck and a UTV used 4% of the time on this property. And there's some guidance in the handbook on how often vehicles used in a preserve setting typically need to be replaced. There's been studies done that show it's about every 8 years. So we went with 8 years here, and we expect to be harder on the ATV. So we're going to plan to replace that every 5 years. And then that gives you this annual cost over here. So the other, since we couldn't list every possible task that might be required, we put an other with a drop-down menu to kind of prompt you to think of other things that might be necessary. And also when you click on various cells, it'll have a little instruction box that pops up to give you further guidance. So you can copy and paste by clicking here, right-clicking, copying and pasting as many times as you need to add additional tasks. And it shouldn't break the formulas. You can also choose if you're planning to perform the task in-house, you can enter materials and labor, or if you're going to contract it out, you can go with contract amount and staff oversight. So moving on to ecological management, we have a bit more activities here on this example. But before we get into that, we don't want to forget that we plan to update the management plan every 5 years. This is something that like everybody does, but I didn't see it very often in examples, so we include some time for that. And then we've included invasive species control, in this case, treating Japanese stiltgrass with herbicide. That'll be done with some in-house staff. And then we'll also do some vegetation management to thin the overstory on south-facing slopes of this oak hickory forest to promote oak regeneration. And so for each of those, we estimated 3 people, 1 regular, 2 short terms, for 1 day each on these tasks. And then we entered the travel expenses up here as 2 separate trips with 6 days for meals, which is 3 people, 2 trips. I'll show an example of a task that's contracted out here in a bit. And then for fire, there's a lot of guidance in the handbook on how to estimate costs associated with prescribed burning. On this preserve, we plan to burn a portion of it every 5 years. So the handbook recommends using a per burn cost rather than a per acre cost, because the mobilization costs are not directly proportional to the acreage of the burn unit. It takes just as much time to plan and mobilize for an 80-acre burn as it does for a 1,000-acre burn. So you really want to make sure you're not selling yourself short there by going with a per acre cost. So from our burn manager, I got an estimate of $6,300 per burn, and then I also included some costs for annual training of the fire crews since they need to stay certified. And in my research, I found an example of a mitigation bank where the long-term manager had planned to partner with their state forestry agency to conduct burns, but that fell through and they decided to develop a fire team in-house, which was a lot more expensive than they had originally planned for. So the endowment that was set aside early on is not meeting all of their expenses now, due largely to fire. And then the last one I'm going to show you, since bat monitoring is not a typical task included on the list, I'll show you how to use this other entry to estimate those costs. So again, when you click on here, this instruction box pops up. We just typed in bat monitoring and we're going to contract that out, include some time for staff oversight for developing the RFP, managing the contract, and then checking their work on site, doing a quick site visit. So we've got this lump sum for the contract. And then the travel expenses, this bat monitoring is only going to happen every 5 years. So we're including that up here under non-annual trips. 1 trip, 1 day, and it'll divide it by 5 here on the next slide. So the extended cost is divided by 5 to get you the annual cost, and then we noted that that was bat monitoring. And the final section here are occupancy related costs, which is really more of an issue for fee lands. Even land trusts, like the Indiana chapter of the Nature Conservancy, we don't exempt all of our properties. So we do pay property taxes on some of them, depending on how our relationship with that particular county is. So we've included that here. And then if there were any other insurance costs or water rights, if there's structures on the property that you need to include utilities, that sort of thing, you can capture all of that here. And finally, now the summary. There are no blue cells here, so you don't enter anything. It's all pulled in from the previous tabs. It pulls in the annual cost subtotals from each of the previous tabs. So this is that number you could use for just annual budgeting if you're not interested in a fund principal amount. Then that's multiplied by our contingency and our admin rates to get the annual cost total, which is divided by the cap rate to give you your principal. And that's what this is, that magic formula right there. So as I mentioned, the site protection monitoring and easement stewardship is separated out from the land management and maintenance because in some circumstances, those may be done by different parties. The funds may be set aside separately. So you can separate them out if you want, or just look for this overall fund total down here to cover all of your costs. And I'll say I've seen examples of fairly simple projects that don't have much in the way of long-term stewardship needs, and so this number is pretty low. And then I've seen some very complex projects with million-dollar funds. So this tool is flexible enough to work for each kind of project. And then I mentioned before, there's a section in the handbook on managing money for the long term that goes into a lot more detail on the different types of funds that might be used to invest, usually a traditional endowment, but not always. And then talks more about choosing that appropriate cap rate. So in our example, our cap rate of 4.5% means you need to target a rate of return of 8.5%. So you need to think about how to invest those funds to achieve that cap rate. You can't just put it in an FDIC insured savings account and expect to get that kind of earning. It needs to be a diversified portfolio, kind of like your 401k. So there's some, our project manager at EPA has a background in economics, so she was very helpful in putting together this section because that's not my background. But it goes into a lot of the how do you finance your fund, whether through a lump sum payment when you're protecting the site initially or setting up a payment schedule, different options like that, and then looking at alternative funding sources such as grants, leases, timber revenue, NRCS programming. And then there's an example from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation of an investment policy statement that does a really good job of pulling all of this together. There are also links to a lot of additional resources. We didn't create this in a vacuum. We pulled a lot from the Land Trust Alliance, has a lot of good resources in their standards and practices curriculum. And the Environmental Law Institute has done some trainings for mitigation providers, and then also the Legal Defense Reserve calculator. So this is just a snapshot of some of the resources that are in the handbook. And then there are also, here's where you can go to download it. And I will just pull up the live website instead. So you can download the calculator right here. There is a version for internal TNC use that includes a little extra data entry to follow our policies and procedures. But the external version is what I use this example for. Then you can download the handbook here, the quick reference guide, which is that step-by-step cheat sheet. And then there's also just a 2-page fact sheet. So if you're trying to explain this to somebody, we've got this little 2-pager that has links to the resources online, and then also a listing. Can you see that? Listing of all of these links that are down here at the bottom. There's a lot of mitigation resources, some Land Trust Alliance, and standards and practices. And I'll note this, we as I said before, we developed it not just for TNC, but for external partners, other land trusts, state agencies, anybody who's owning or managing land or easements. We'd be happy for you to use it. So please forward it to anyone who might be interested. And we'll be doing some additional outreach in the next few months. We're putting together an online tutorial that'll be on the website to walk through the steps of using the calculator. And we're presenting it at an in-lieu fee mitigation workshop next month in St. Paul, Minnesota. Then we'll also be doing a session in conjunction with LTA at the Land Trust Alliance Rally in October, presenting with Lori Barrett, who developed the Legal Defense Reserves Calculator. So that should be a good session. And then we'll be just getting the word out, doing additional webinars and newsletter articles. So I would welcome your feedback if you use it. Let me know how it works, and let me know if there's any questions at this time. Let's see. Ooh, really good question from Nathan. Often maintenance either increases or decreases over time as projects are added or completed on each property. How are these yearly variations taken into account as time goes on? So I would say the contingency rate that's added in there helps cover some of that. But if it's a substantially new activity, like you're restoring an old field by planting trees or something, that would have to be covered with additional funding elsewhere through grants or whatever. This is really just intended to cover the routine annual maintenance and monitoring. And can it be edited? Can you add additional fields specific to your property? So yes, you can. Right now, the spreadsheet is locked. So but if you want to add any additional hourly rates, when you click on that plus, it will prompt you to unlock it, and it gives you instructions on how to do that. So I just locked it so that you can't easily mess it up, but it's really easy to unlock it. And then you can copy and paste those other entries, and I've experimented with it, and that does not break any formulas. So you can copy and paste as much as you want to add additional tasks. And then you can also type in a lot of the descriptions and the notes to get more specific on what kind of task you're budgeting for. So hopefully that answers your question. Anyone else? Well, as I said, it is available for download. We just finished it, and it went live last month. So I've heard from a few people who are interested in using it, but I haven't gotten actual examples of it being used on the ground. So I'd be happy to answer more questions by email or phone as you're using it. There's also a link on the website to email me if you want updates, if we do additional updates. We don't have plans as it is right now to revise this, but we're going to see how it works in practice, and then if there's interest and the need, we could seek additional funding to revise it in the future. And if you want to just be on my email list to get any notifications about that, then you can email me.
Okay, if nobody has any more questions, Angela, thank you so much. That was wonderful. We just have a little bit of wrap up to do here, so I'm going to share my screen. And I just wanted to First of all, thank everybody for, oops, that wasn't what I meant to do. Hold on. Here we go. We want everyone to watch your email for information on the second webinar registration, which is coming soon. And for those of you who are not registered for our conference, if you're still on the fence about coming, there's a great video on our YouTube channel that functions as an invitation that really gives the lay of the land and why exactly you should really make the time to go. So I think that's absolutely everything. Do you have anything to add, Lisa?
No, nothing else.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. And thank you to Angela. And we'll be posting the video of this session on our YouTube channel soon. So watch for that. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everyone.